Hi, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 2 on evolution. In our last conversation, we talked about how Darwin um, had a conflict with the idea, the church's idea of the age of the earth. Darwin had experienced an earthquake in Ecuador near Concepcion, and he saw that the earth had risen by 3 feet. And he saw these mussels that were stranded. They'd been pulled out of the ocean where the sea crust had risen. He saw those shells there. And of course, he went up into the mountains and found shells 3,000 feet in the mountains. And of course, at the time, Bishop Ussher's estimate of the Earth's age, Bishop Ussher was a bishop from Ireland in the 1600s, and Bishop Ussher had studied the Bible, and he had decided that the age of the earth based on the Bible was, or the date of creation was October 22nd at 6 p.m., 4004 BC. And Darwin knew this wasn't the case. Okay. Here's Darwin. There's a picture of his finches. You know, Darwin didn't stop at Concepcion, although Concepcion, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It's in Chile. As he sailed up the coast, he got to Ecuador, and then they took off out into the Pacific Ocean to an island called the Galapagos, or an island chain called the Galapagos Island Chains, and he saw all kinds of other stuff out there. So at the Galapagos, he saw marine iguanas. Now, iguanas, if you've ever been south of the border here, you can see iguanas in Florida and Central America. They're endemic down there everywhere. But you never seen a marine iguana. There were terrestrial iguanas there, but then there were this new species of iguana that he identified. In fact, he saw lots of different new species. He saw these giant land tortoises, all kinds of extravagant insects, and he found all these birds, and he didn't know much about birds. And he saw that these birds all looked alike with some minor variations, or some variations, specific variations in the shape of their bill and their behaviors. Some were nocturnal, some were insectivores, some just ate nuts. The ones that ate nuts didn't fly much. They hopped around on the ground. They didn't fly much. They had big giant beaks and helped them crack open the nuts. The ones that were insectivores had little tiny beaks that could allow them to get into nooks and crannies inside of branches. There was a bunch of, he studied about, I think about 6 or 7 different subtypes, different species of birds, he thought, and he sent them back to his buddy in England. And later, he found out that they were all finches. So between the iguana and the finches, Darwin said, well, look, there's a possibility that, a bunch of finches all flew out to the islands, all with different adaptations, like a tiny beak or a big beak to crack nuts, but that's unlikely. What's more likely is that at some period deep in the history, deep in the past, there was a small population of birds, and over time, variations in their offspring let them undergo changes. And today we call this changes speciation. Well, those thoughts Darwin wrote in his book On the Origin of Species that was published in 1859. He was 50 years old. In fact, he waited almost 20 years before he published the book. Here are his finches. Darwin said that really the most important pieces of evidence that helped him think about his theory were the fossil evidence. So this is the fossil of this giant ground sloth. Okay, there are tree sloths in South America today, but he found a complete fossil skeleton of a Megatherium, this giant ground sloth. He said that the fossil evidence helped him come up with this idea. Of course, he didn't exist in a vacuum, right? Darwin had lots of influences, scientists that were of the day, and then scientists that actually preceded him by a long period of time. So some of those people include Lamarck, Malthus, Lyell, Hutton, and Cuvier. Let's talk about Lamarck. Now, Darwin's seen as the father of modern evolutionary thought, and his book really does sum it all up. But hey, there was a guy, Lamarck, who was around almost 150 years earlier. So Lamarck had written his Philosophie zoologique And in that, he said that species change over time. Of course, that's what evolution is. And of course, Lamarck was confronting the same sort of dogmatic church at the time, maybe even a more powerful church and a more vengeful church in the 1600s. Uh, Lamarck said this. Lamarck accepted the idea of creation. He said God created the animals back in the day in the Garden of Eden, and so why do we have frogs in England and frogs in Morocco that are so different? And he said, well, inside of each organism was this desire for perfection, and that desire for perfection allowed it to change in response to its environment. Now, Lamarck's been held up and ridiculed because one of the examples he used was the example of the giraffe. And what he was saying is, in essence, was that over time, during the lifetime of an organism, it could acquire traits. It would get a longer neck if it stretched its neck. If you lifted weights, you'd get more muscles. And he thought that you could pass those traits on to the offspring. So Lamarck's idea was the passing of acquired traits, and we see that that's not true, but also sort of true. In fact, there's a whole new science today called epigenetics. The Landmark study about 20 years ago was done in Sweden with some mice. They overfed mice, they made them into obese, and then they bred those obese mice together. And guess what they got? Well, they got skinny mice. And those skinny mice, they took and they tried to overfeed them, and they never got fat again. And what they found was that some of the genes hadn't been changed, but they'd been turned off. And so that's what the study of epigenetics is all about. It's about turning genes on and off. And in fact, you can turn genes off and then give that turned off gene to your offspring. So Lamarck was sort of right. But let's talk about Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was an economist, and he noticed that populations always outstrip the resources of their environment. And I'll use this idea of the tragedy of the commons to help bring this home for you. So back in the day in feudal England, back when there were kings and dukes and earls, etc., the woods were full of deer. Could you hunt the deer? Yeah. If you did, you got hung or flayed or disemboweled because that was the king's deer. You weren't allowed to eat the king's deer. There was plenty of pasture for your sheep. Were you allowed to graze your sheep in the pastures? Heck no. That's the duke's pasture. If you were a serf, if you were a peasant, you got something called the commons. So in your village, there would be a place where you could plant your potatoes along with your serf friends, and you could graze your sheep with your serf friends' sheep. And guess what happened to the commons? Well, it got overused. So that's what we call the tragedy of the commons, and we see this phenomenon over and over again in populations. Malthus saw it in economic systems, but look down here. I've got the human population growth curve, and I want you to notice. Look, from the beginning of time, this is a 2 million year old thing, I think here, up until about 1800. For the most time, we were at about 500 million organisms, less than half a billion, right? 500,000 humans. At 1800, they estimate a billion people. And 1850, we've got 2 billion. And we don't get to 3 billion until 1960. 1950. 1960, we've got 4, etc. This is an old graph. This is from it only goes up to 1990 with 6 billion. We're at like almost 8 billion today. And you guys, I've shown you growth curves before. Remember, we go from a linear growth to exponential growth. And there's this number called a carrying capacity for every environment. And so, typically populations will exceed the carrying capacity, and then you have a die-off, and then you come to some natural harmonic number of individuals. And so where are we in this growth curve? What's the carrying capacity of the Earth? Have we exceeded it? Are we approaching the carrying capacity of the Earth? A lot of people would say that we've exceeded it already. Another important influence was Charles Lyell. Darwin's friend from Oxford, and his buddy James Hutton. And their theory, their observations led to a geological principle called gradualism. So in gradualism, the idea is that, look, the geological processes that are happening today have always happened at the same pace. If it takes a river 1 year to erode 1 meter of soil, then it's always taken that river 1 year to erode 1 meter of soil. So how long would it take the Colorado River to actually erode its way through, I don't know, 6,000 feet of canyon? What's a long time? And Lyell and Darwin were friends. They collaborated throughout their lifetime. Of course, the clear observation, the clear conclusion to be drawn through gradualism is that geological time is impossible for the humans to actually fathom. Okay, we only live for 70 years. 70 years is nothing in terms of geological time. On the other hand, there's Georges Cuvier with a C. Cuvier, and his idea was catastrophism, also with a C. And Cuvier said that like geological change can happen overnight. You have these massive volcanic eruptions, or you have asteroid impacts, or you have floods. Of course, that's all true as well. All right, so we have catastrophic changes, we have gradual change, we have this competition for resources. Anyway, Darwin put these all together in his observations. He said, number one, that individuals and populations vary, right? I'm different from my brother and sister. We're different from our neighbors' kids. We all have different strengths and weaknesses. Not only that, but there's always too many of us. And because there's too many of us and there's limited resources in an environment, we're going to compete. We're going to compete for resources, and some are going to win and some are going to lose. Well, that in combination with geological time allowed Darwin to come up with his theory. Now, his theory wasn't evolution. His theory wasn't natural selection, but that was the mechanism for evolution. Darwin's theory is called descent with modification. And in descent with modification, just like Lamarck, he thought that back in the day we had this simple form, and then that branched out into these more complex tree of life, a tree of life. Here's literally a page from his notebook that he wrote on the Beagle. I have the original progenitor species. They're introduced to an environment, and then they have branches because their offspring vary. And some of the offspring are really good and end up on this branch, and some end up on this branch. Anyway, descent with modification says that all organisms today evolved from previous species as a result of a process called natural selection. Well, I guess we have a little time here to talk about natural selection. What is natural selection? Well, natural selection says that the world or the nature selects, right? Look, some individuals have advantageous traits that make them better adapted to the environment. And we call these advantageous traits adaptations. If you have an adaptive trait, you're going to be more likely to survive and reproduce. In fact, in order for it to be adaptive, you have to live long enough to have babies who live long enough to have babies, right? So remember that competition occurs between the different variants, the different offspring, and that we can talk about your level of fitness. It isn't how fast you can ride your bike, your fitness level. It's how well adapted you are for your environment. Okay, fitness is a measure of how well adapted you are. And the truth is that some of us are better adapted for our environment than others, right? And so every habitat has different important challenges, and your fitness is the ability for you to survive in that specific habitat. And habitats change, right? Habitats change. So species can change over time through this process of evolution driven by natural selection. Adaptations are what make you different from others. You can see these two leopards here, and they're both adapted for different environments, okay? They probably started from the original progenitor leopard species and then Some became dark over time to be adapted to the forest, and then some became light over time to be adapted to the lighter mountain, snowy environment where they lived.